Good evening, I'm David Nicholas, and next on CMU Public Television, the newly elected Michigan House Speaker, Republican Representative Kevin Cotter, joins me on Capitol Report.
Welcome to Capitol Report, a weekly discussion with your elected officials on the issues and concerns that affect you.
Well, good evening once again, and thanks for being with us for our first program of this 2015 season, as we welcome as our guest for the first show, House Speaker Kevin Cotter. He was elected to a third term in November to represent the 99th District, and then elected by his party to serve as Speaker for this 98th Michigan Legislature. Good to see you, Mr. Speaker. Congratulations, and welcome back to our program.
Well, thank you so much, David. It's great to be back with you.
This is a long question, so bear with us, but there is a very complicated nature, obviously, to the issue that's going to be much of our focus, and it's the state of the state's roads. The governor made it a major priority for the past 4 years, and in the last session, two proposals came from the lawmakers, neither passing in either chamber despite the GOP majorities in both. We have now the ballot proposal that's come before us in May, but even as we were getting ready to sit down and have this conversation, news this week about a so-called loophole, an economist predicting that if the sales tax is raised, a $100 million potential penalty then in federal taxes that would kick in for the state's taxpayers. And now the discussion from yesterday to as we sit down today, a member of your caucus, Representative Ferlini, calling for the legislature to provide a backup plan should the proposal not pass in May. The governor setting that aside, saying that any added federal taxes are not verifiable at this time, and if they prove to be, they are, quote, easy to fix. So much more to get into from this issue that has been with us for such a time, all of the time that the governor's been in office, coinciding with your time in the legislature. How can we sort that out here this morning and see what's really in front of us?
Well, we may need a couple episodes to do that, but let's start. First, the roads, and I think, the length of the question and all of the facets of it really highlight the sheer sophistication of this problem. It's a big problem. And, my 4 years, the governor's 4 years, we've been working on this problem, especially the last 3 years. I know in his State of the State address in 2012, the governor really laid this firmly before the legislature and said, I want you to tackle this problem. Here's a solution. If you don't like mine, come up with your own, is essentially what his message was. And the solution that he proposed at that time was not popular, so we spent a lot of time really putting alternatives out there and really dissecting them. And really our position was that there are no such thing as bad ideas. We agree there's a problem, but how do we solve it? And we spent really the last 3 years doing that. And you mentioned just at the end of last session, really the summer of last year, both the House and the Senate came up with options, and we couldn't really agree as to how we were going to raise it. Really, the Senate plan was all new revenue, new taxes that would be put on at the gas pumps where people would pay more at the pump.
Now, is that close to, pardon me, the proposal that was one of those that met with some public backlash before was the hike of gas tax and then also the hike in vehicle registration fees, if we remember from prior discussions?
Well, you've got it exactly. That was the plan the governor put out. The State of the State of 2012 was all new revenue, so all new money being raised to go into the roads. Roughly half of it was going to come from an increase at the gas tax. The other half was going to come from an increase at the vehicle registration fees, and that's the one I was referring to that didn't go over so well. And so we spent a lot of time bringing forward alternatives. There were, no ideas were left unchecked. The Senate's plan, what they came up with ultimately, was actually putting it all in an increase at the gas pump. The House plan that we put together was actually doing it all with existing revenue. It was going to require some reallocation of dollars from some areas to others, and that also was not popular. So we spent much of the lame duck session of 2014 working on what we have now, this current proposal. And I have to say, this proposal, for me, there were certain things that it had to meet. It had to fully address the problem, raising $1.2 billion per year for the roads. Another personal requirement was I wanted to see us get the sales tax off of gasoline. Right now, Michigan is one of a handful of states that when you buy gas at the pump, the price that you see on the sign actually includes a lot of different taxes. We have the state gasoline tax that goes to the roads. We have the federal tax, but we also have a sales tax. And so when we had, just a couple of months ago, when we had $4 a gallon gas at 6%, we had roughly 24 cents being generated in sales tax that wasn't going to the roads. That goes to schools and local governments. And so the plan that we ultimately put together, and frankly, I will say, I think it took all of us outside of our comfort zone, one area or another. But it was really a good bipartisan plan because we had members from both sides and both chambers coming together. I think everyone working outside of their comfort zone to put forward this plan that would say, okay, we're going to take the sales tax off gasoline and we'll apply that so prices will remain revenue neutral at the pump. We'll apply that to the roads. That gets us money for the roads. And then the sales tax piece, if the voters approve it, going from 6% to 7% on the general sales tax, will actually backfill schools and local governments. And so,
which stood to lose money if there were some proposals that said raise the sales tax but take the tax off of the pump, and then suddenly we were going to have this shortfall in the school aid fund.
Exactly.
And the local governments, in terms of revenue sharing, we're also going to see a hit. All of that you're saying has been addressed in the way that this is structured now. The agreement that is now currently sitting before us to be voted on in May, correct?
That is correct. That is correct. It is an increase. And so when I mentioned taking myself personally and several others out of our comfort zone, it is an increase. But one thing that I want to make very clear, there has been some speculation that the legislature punted to the voters. And I push back against that strongly because I think this is actually a good check and balance that we have. The reason we have to go to the voters is because in our Constitution, this is back under Proposal A when we went from 4% to 6% in the sales tax, that's capped by the Constitution. So that's really, the voters put in place a safety valve that says, okay, if you want to go beyond this, you have to come back to us. So in order to go to a sales tax increase, this is the way that we have to go. And you know, this plan, we have some education to do to get all of the information out to the public. And when I say that, this plan has a lot of pieces to it. One piece that has not gotten a lot of coverage yet is the fact that this plan will pay down $1.2 billion of debt that we have in the state. We have a lot of debt in the state. It was actually one of the biggest surprises I had when I was new to the legislature was the amount of debt that we had. Well, the particular piece of this that it would pay down was we as a state currently owe $2.5 billion on road work that was done back in the late 90s, early 2000s. That was bonded at the time that road work was done, and we owe $2.5 billion. What this plan will do is it says, okay, if the voters pass it in May, on October 1, when the state's fiscal year kicks off, that sales tax would take effect at that point. So it's going to raise all of that revenue in the first year. And many of us, myself included, felt that if we just injected $1.2 billion into the road building industry, that we're going to drive inefficiency. And the reason I say that is because as we have continued more and more over the years of underinvesting in the roads, there's been a natural contraction within the road building industry. This is private sector as it is public sector in the government. And so if we just put all that money in there, it's going to take time to hire and train employees. It's going to take time to buy equipment because there are lead times to getting that equipment. And so what this would do, and I don't want to get too heavy in the numbers, but I think it's really important that the public understand that in the first year when that 1.2 is generated, this plan would put a third of it, or $400 million, into the roads. The other $800 million is not going to go off to another pet project, but that $800 million would go to paying down the debt. Then in year 2, it becomes a 2/3, 1/3, $800 million to the roads, $400 to the debt. And then in year 3, it's fully implemented, all going to current road work. So throughout that exercise, we get $1.2 billion that's going to pay down debt.
What do we project, because the governor's original call was for the $1.2 billion to be generated somehow, some way, over a period of 10 years to not only address work that hasn't been done, to bring everything back up to speed, but to go forward. So there's still a little bit of a give and take here to address, as you say, the issue of paying down the past debt. Are there any projections from transportation officials, the road people, that would say, you know, so far this winter has not been as bad as last, but what we can project in terms of the costs that we would be facing? If we can't put all of $1.2 billion towards it right away, how much more damage or fallback in the condition overall of the roads, and how much more, I guess for lack of a better term, catch-up do we have to do?
Yeah, and that's, the school's still out. I mean, there are varying arguments. You know, some would argue that $1.2 billion a year is not enough. We had some input from some of the road building industry would say that, you know, it's actually north of $2 billion a year. And I got to a point after, 3 years of this debate of saying, okay, we can all agree that at least $1.2 billion is needed. Some will still say that's not enough, but let's at least settle on a number and get started. Because if we argue about, how big the number is, we're just allowing the road structure that we have currently to continue to deteriorate, and it's not a productive conversation. So let's at least get started now. This is significant, and I think that, when we're talking about billions, how do we wrap our mind around, how do the citizens wrap their mind around what's the impact of that going to be? And I think what was so telling for me was I had a discussion recently with local elected government officials in Isabella County, and after talking with the director of the County Road Commission here, I said, okay, let's try to put this in perspective. What will the impact be on just this county? And the information that was shared was, well, currently we have a $5 million a year budget. If this passes and is fully implemented, we'll be at about $8.5 million. So $3.5 million, that's a significant increase to a $5 million budget. And I think that's a little easier to look at and say, okay, we can see that would have a real impact in a given county, and other counties can do the same.
Back then to where we've seen some glitches in this moving forward, at least from the standpoint of ballot proposal waiting for the vote in May. First of all, to the Anderson group that put out this economic study, the governor is not totally dismissing it, but says that it may be raising more caution than is necessary. Hasn't been totally verified, as we said in our first kind of intro, setting all this up. Where do you and the lawmakers, I mean, this is just out this week as we sit down, where do you put stock in the numbers they're presenting, that if we hike the sales tax, if the voters approve it, that somehow there's this unforeseen, unexpected? I mean, how did we miss a potential loophole of a $100 million penalty coming from a trigger to other federal taxes?
Yeah, and this is one piece of the plan, and we didn't miss it. We were aware of this, and it wasn't reckless because we can fix it. As the governor alluded to, we can fix this piece of the plan if it is determined that this additional cost is going to be there. What it all comes down to is a ruling of the Internal Revenue Service, or really their interpretation of the type of system that we're using to value vehicles. One piece of the plan that we're referring to here is how registration fees are calculated. Excuse me. So currently, we do it on what's called ad valorem, or based on the value of the vehicle. And so there's some concern, at least by one economist, as you mentioned, that we would be changing this with some changes the plan makes to registration fees, that we would then no longer be able to deduct the cost of the registration for federal income tax purposes. Now, this only applies to people that itemize their deductions. So that's about 29 or 30% of all people. And I don't say that to minimize this. If it affects anyone, we need to take a look at it. And we're going to do that. This report just came out this week, and we're digging into it now and getting the advice and opinions of other economists as well. Anytime we have economists, we have varying opinions. And so we're going to make a very informed decision here.
The language is out there. I mean, so it sets this in place. I mean, the governor's saying, and you just said the same, it could be something that is fixable, for lack of a better term. So, I mean, is it that easy of a fix? Because $100 million is enough probably to start driving the elusive poll numbers for people now saying, wait a minute, I'm not sure I'm going to cast a vote for this come May.
Yeah, I think we have to clear it up. Obviously, $100 million is significant, but we do have time to fix it.
Now to the issue then, I suppose, and whether or not this was prompted immediately on the heels of the Anderson report, or just misgivings, or at least having a so-called backup plan to the call from Representative Ferlini, a Republican member of the legislature, who says we need a backup plan. And I guess there's somewhat two parts to this question. I mean, the vote's going to be yes or no. So has the legislature, you and Senate Majority Arlen Meekhoff, do you have a plan B of your own should the ballot proposal not go through? Or was there something now that is totally needed to be created, as Representative Ferlini is calling for?
If there were to be a plan B, it would have to be created. What I mean by that is there's certainly not agreement between myself and the Senate Majority Leader. We haven't had this discussion yet as to what plan B would look like. I think we would both naturally go back to our respective plans as a starting point. And I feel that way personally. I would go back to the last passed House plan, which was the, doing it largely with current revenue. And I can say that if we were to do that, it would be a painful approach, as it's going to result in some reductions in other areas. So, we're going to continue to have those conversations. I'm not losing confidence yet. There's obviously a lot of work to do to get the ballot proposal passed, a lot that has to happen in getting the word out to the public. But it's too early to turn our backs on this plan. Any campaign has its ups and downs, and certainly in the early stages, the public sentiment can be negative about it. But there's still over 3 months to go before the vote would happen.
It's a lot of votes to potentially count, not so much from the public standpoint, but even within the legislature itself. You say that you would revert to the House plan. When I had a conversation with analyst Bill Ballinger, he said that he felt that if the ballot proposal didn't pass, that he felt Lansing as a whole would revert to the House version from last year as opposed to the Senate one. So at one point, do you and Senate Majority Leader Meekhoff start having those discussions to see where there may be some give and take should we get to that point? Are we... At what point do we have to come up with, and I guess there's another thought that just occurred to me is what right now, and I don't even know if folks have thought about this, the ballot proposal comes in May, and even though we have winter linger for some time, there is a thought that we need money now that's already been earmarked. Has that been done to kickstart a construction season that would be getting underway by the late spring and into early summer by the time, because if it passes and people start spending and money starts coming in, that's great, but what about the current 2015 construction season? What money has been set aside and budgeted so far?
That's a great point, and that's something that we're talking about now. I had some discussions recently with folks at MDOT, and we do have some options. So what we'd want to do is we don't want to spend money that we don't have. But if the May ballot passes, fortunately that's fairly early in the spring, then we could look at an option because we have the assurances that that revenue will be coming. We could look at pulling some of that ahead. There's some attractive options that exist right now in looking at short-term financing as rates are exceptionally low. So we could look at that. We could look at pulling some ahead so that we don't lose the 2015 construction season. Because just like I feel about transportation funding overall, is each day that passes, that is an ongoing tax increase because we're allowing the roads to deteriorate further. And so we would have that kind of as a stopgap measure.
Money then, and you've already touched on this to a degree, for local governments and also for the schools in the structure that we had before, the potential shortfall, how that's been addressed in this language moving forward. As we look, and you talked about, should the ballot proposal pass, money would come back around to fund those in a way that it had not before. When folks try to, it's all going to depend on how much people spend and so forth with the hike in the sales tax triggering all these things. But when people start to look at long-term budgeting for local governments and for schools, has anybody been able to come up with numbers of where are we going to, in the long run, be further ahead with money going to the school aid fund, moving ahead with money going back to the municipalities, or is that still a question to be answered?
It's not a question to the extent that both groups would be ahead. That, without question, both schools and local governments will be ahead if this passes. There is that possibility of some fluctuation, based on sales, but it's far better. We're looking at an additional $300 million a year to schools, and we're also looking at about $100 million or $95 million
just
to
in the
local
structure of
governments.
the language alone, you can project, and lawmakers can project that those two funds will have more than they have had in the past.
Absolutely.
Okay. Into all this, we now throw the projected $300 million shortfall in the state budget. This seems to have almost gotten lost in the last couple of weeks as the revenue estimates first came in. Is this money from the general fund? Is this money from the K-12 budget? Where exactly? And there will be more revenue estimates, obviously, moving forward before we would get to the end of the fiscal year. But how is this being addressed, at least in the early going?
I'm working on that as we speak, and when I leave here, I'll be working on it further, and it's actually closer to $500 million. And what this is so this is the current year budget, so the budget that started in October 1 of 14 and will carry us through most of 15. And what it is, it's fueled, we can see clearly what brought this about, and it's these credits that are out there. You're probably hearing a lot of talk about mega credits, about these big business credits that were issued several years ago. This was one of the first things we tackled in 2011, was to stop this practice of giving away these huge credits. And what has caused this is each year when we pass the budget, we based it on projections of what the revenue will be. Well, the problem with these credits, and these are exceptionally large credits, we don't have any control when those are used by businesses that have them. And so as we have seen the economy pick up, and it is continuing to pick up, I don't want this shortfall to make it sound as though things are going backward. It's actually, a consequence of things improving, because as businesses are doing better, they're incurring more tax liability. Well, that's when they use the credits. And so we have far more credits being used than we projected in the budget, and that's created this shortfall. So what we're doing right now is working to close that gap. And so there are going to be some cuts as a result. We have to fix the current year budget before February 11th, when the governor comes out with his projection for next year's budget. Before we can even get to work on that, we need to close the gap on the current year, and we're working on that right now.
The governor and the state of the state called for the combination of the state's departments of community health and human services, calling it a move towards greater efficiency, streamlining services at the state level. Some, as one would expect, labeling this as an unlikely call for maybe big government from a sitting Republican governor. How exactly is this going to work? I mean, it was a shorter address. He has always been one to lay out, at least in broad terms, more of the specifics coming in a budget proposal, but this is one that doesn't even require the legislature. He can do this by executive action. So what exactly is being proposed here, and how would it look in the end?
Yeah, so what we're looking at, and you know, like any state of the state, it's difficult to get a lot of details out there. There's so much that a governor wants to cover, and he had about 55 minutes within which to get this all in. But this is a very exciting proposal. The reason I say that is each year we go through the budget process, there's always a call for, you know, let's get more money to this area, let's get more money to this area at the expense of this area. When you want to make those changes within the budget, there are a handful of departments that you can look at, because that's where general fund money is really being spent. These two departments included, we look at the Department of Community Health, the Department of Human Services. These are two monster departments that do very important work, by the way, but over 14,000 employees within these two departments. And what I think is so attractive about this is you look at, okay, we haven't always done it this way. We haven't always operated as two separate departments. So we have what I believe are going to be efficiencies that we can find from an administration standpoint of two state departments. Much of this is in Lansing physically, but I get excited about it too when you look at on the street where the services are provided. You look at it in our community right here. We have DHS at one end of town. Across town, we have the Department of Community Health. And there's overlap. As you look at these two populations of people that are being served, again, very important services, there are some overlap. You have some people that are getting services from both departments, having to answer to multiple caseworkers, being chopped up into so many different programs, and saying, okay, is this good for people? Can we provide better service by actually managing individuals as opposed to them being managed by government? And so we're going to go through a process over the next several months of looking at this and finding ways that we can serve people better, while I believe at the same time finding efficiencies and allowing us to potentially fund other priorities.
Any others from your position as a lawmaker that has been discussed in your, so far 4 years in Lansing, of other departments where we might see something similar proposed, either from the lawmaker's point of view or something that would be suggested for the governor to take action on?
You know, certainly this is the one that's front and center right now is DHS and DCH, but there are other areas of the budget. We have a brand new crop of legislators that have come in the House. We've had over a third of the body has just turned over, and we have a lot of members that are very interested in that, myself included, in looking at where else can we find efficiencies. And there are other departments that will be looked at, certainly, and just, with the mindset of making sure that, especially at times when we have a current budget shortfall, are we making the best use of the dollars that we have? Looking at it from investments that the state makes with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, MEDC, making sure that we're making smart investments. That's certainly an area we'll be looking at too.
Just in our last minute that we have, at least for this portion of our conversation, where do we stand with corrections? It's one of the larger budgets. It's one that came under fire with the Aramark contract during 2014. As we start into this new year, where do we stand in terms of how that department is being run?
Corrections is always an area that gets looked at closely when we're looking at how can we fund other priorities. And right now in Michigan, we're spending over $2 billion a year on our corrections department. And there's often comments that are made during a budgeting process, and people say, okay, we need to spend less on prisons and more on kids. We need to spend less on prisons or more on fill in the blank. And I agree with that to the extent that we can find efficiencies, but at the same time, we can't just open up the gates, let the inmates out, and jeopardize public safety. So the Aramark contract that you mentioned, looking at going to the private sector and contracting out some services, that's something that we looked at, and this plan, is projected to save $14 million a year. That's a step, but it certainly hasn't been without controversy. There were some bumps in the road, and I don't minimize those. Those are serious, and we're working to work those out. But these are the types of things that we have to be willing to look at if we want to get savings while still protecting public safety.
Well, we knew going in as we set this up that there would be many things to cover and literally on the table. We haven't even touched on some of the things that you bring to the table with an agenda and priorities that you're setting in the new role as a speaker. I'm hoping then that you can stay with us for maybe some additional conversation on us, and we can welcome the audience to join us again next week as we talk some more.
I would love to.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that, and thank you for your time and attention. We will then be continuing this conversation with Michigan's new House Speaker, Representative Kevin Cotter. If you missed or would like to see a portion of this again, remember we do have a repeat broadcast coming up this Saturday the 7th. That will be at 6:30 p.m., and we will be eventually posting all of our programs, of course, through the course of the season to our website at WCMU.org. Click on television and go to the Capitol Report page. In the meantime, for all of us here, thanks, and we'll continue our conversation with the House Speaker again for next week.
You've been watching Capitol Report. Join us again as your elected officials speak to your concerns on current issues.